The Nile turns red at dawn, and for one horrifying moment, no one in Egypt knows if it's blood or something worse. Fish are already dying by the thousands, floating belly up against the riverbank. The smell hits before the sight does. And somewhere in a palace built to look eternal, a king who believes he is a living god is about to discover that he is not the only power in this story, and that the God he has never taken seriously is about to walk through his kingdom 10 times, and leave nothing standing the way it stood before. This is not a random string of disasters. Every single plague that falls on Egypt is aimed at something specific. A god, a belief, a piece of Pharaoh's own claim to power. And by the time you see the whole pattern laid out in order, you will never read this story as a simple list of 10 bad days again. Some Egyptologists have pointed to a fragmentary document known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian text describing a period of chaos where the river is blood, where plague sweeps the land, and where the son of the highborn is no longer to be recognized as a possible echo, generations later, of a national memory too catastrophic to fully forget, even if its cause was never recorded the way Israel recorded it. Scholars disagree sharply on whether this text describes the same events at all, and it should be weighed with real caution rather than treated as proof. But it is a striking reminder that ancient Egypt was not immune to remembering its worst years. Start with the man at the center of it. Pharaoh was not just a king to the Egyptians. He was believed to be the living incarnation of the god Horus, and after death, he would become Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Egypt's entire religious system existed to prop up exactly one claim. The man on that throne is divine, and everything under the sun answers to him. So when Moses walks into that court and says, "Let my people go," he is not simply requesting a policy change. He is challenging the single most sacred assumption an entire civilization has built its identity around. Pharaoh's answer is immediate, and it is contempt. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord." To understand the weight of that contempt, it helps to remember exactly what Israel had become inside Egypt by this point. What began generations earlier as a welcomed family, given the best land in Goshen because one of their own had saved Egypt from famine, had curdled over centuries into forced labor on an industrial scale, building entire storage cities, the text says, named Pithom and Ramses, under taskmasters instructed to work them ruthlessly and to make their lives bitter with hard service. Pharaoh's most recent policy, before Moses ever arrives, was ordering Hebrew midwives to quietly murder every baby boy at birth. This is not a story that begins with two evenly matched powers negotiating terms. It begins with an empire at the height of its confidence, standing over a people it has spent generations trying to work, and then kill, into nothing. You are about to find out exactly who the Lord is. Before the first plague falls, it helps to notice something about the shape of what's coming, because these 10 plagues are not simply thrown at Egypt in random order. Scholars who study this passage closely have long noticed they fall into 3 matching sets of 3, followed by one final, decisive blow that stands apart from all the rest. In the first plague of each set, the first, fourth, and seventh, Moses confronts Pharaoh in the morning, specifically at the riverbank, before the plague begins. In the second plague of each set, the second, fifth, and eighth, Moses simply goes to Pharaoh's palace and delivers the warning directly. And in the third plague of each set, the third, sixth, and ninth, there is no warning at all. The plague simply happens. 3 sets, each following the exact same rhythm, escalating in severity every time it repeats, building toward a 10th plague announced with more advance warning and more specific detail than any of the 9 before it. This was never chaos. It was composition. The first blow lands on the river itself. The Nile was not just water to Egypt, it was worshipped directly as the god Hapi, and its annual flooding was credited to the god Osiris, whose bloodstream the Egyptians believed the river itself represented. Every harvest, every trade route, every meal in Egypt traced back to this single river, which is precisely why Moses is told to strike it first. Moses stretches out his staff, and the entire river turns to blood, not a metaphor, the text insists, but blood you could see and smell, thick enough that the fish choked and died by the millions, thick enough that Egyptians had to dig new wells along the riverbank just to find water they could drink. The water Egypt trusted more than almost anything else on earth becomes undrinkable, and the God they believed animated it does nothing to stop it. For 7 straight days, the nation that called this river the bloodstream of a god watches it become exactly that, and utterly useless to them. 7 days later, the second blow comes, and this one is almost darkly comic in how it targets Egyptian religion directly. Frogs erupt out of the ruined river by the millions, into houses, into beds, into ovens, into kneading bowls. Here is what makes this plague so pointed. The Egyptian goddess Hecate, associated with fertility and childbirth, was depicted with the head of a frog, and figurines of her were kept in homes across Egypt as protective charms. A creature sacred enough that killing one carelessly could carry real consequences suddenly becomes an unstoppable, revolting infestation, completely beyond Pharaoh's magicians' ability to reverse, though notably, not beyond their ability to replicate. They can make more frogs. They cannot make them stop. Notice that pattern, because it will repeat. Pharaoh's magicians can always seem to match God's first move. What they can never do, not even once across all 10 plagues, is undo anything God has already done. The third blow arrives without warning and without a prior confrontation with Pharaoh at all. Dust across the land turns to gnats, or lice, swarming over both people and animals, small enough to seem almost trivial compared to a river of blood. Yet in a culture where priests shaved their entire bodies daily specifically to avoid any trace of ritual impurity from vermin, an unstoppable infestation of biting insects was its own kind of religious catastrophe. And here, for the first time, Pharaoh's own magicians hit a wall. They try to reproduce it, the way they had with the frogs, and they cannot. This is the finger of God, they tell Pharaoh. Not Moses' magic trick, something else entirely. An admission from the very men whose job was to defend Pharaoh's claim to divine power. Pharaoh's heart, the text says, was hardened, and he would not listen. This phrase, hardened, will repeat again and again through this story, and it deserves attention. At several points, the text says God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and at other points, it says Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Notice, too, which comes first. In the earliest plagues, it is consistently Pharaoh's own heart doing the hardening, his own choice, made freely, again and again, even as the evidence in front of him grows harder and harder to dismiss. Only later in the story, after that pattern has repeated itself many times over, does the text begin describing God hardening what Pharaoh has already spent so long hardening himself. The pattern suggests something unsettling and true about how repeated defiance works. The more you refuse to change course, the harder that refusal becomes to reverse, whether or not something in you is doing the hardening. Until eventually, a heart that has said no often enough may find saying yes has become almost impossible. If this kind of pattern hidden inside a familiar story is what keeps you coming back to this channel, this is exactly the kind of thread we pull every single week. The fourth plague brings swarms of flies, thick enough to ruin the land, and among the gods this plague implicates is Khepri, the scarab beetle deity associated with rebirth and the rising sun, whose image was carved onto amulets and worn by the living and buried with the dead alike as protection. An uncontrollable swarm of insects overrunning the country was not simply unpleasant to a civilization that had turned an insect into a sacred symbol of divine order. But this time, God draws a line no plague has drawn before. The flies swarm everywhere in Egypt, except in Goshen, the region where the Israelites live. For the first time in this story, there is a visible, undeniable distinction between the two peoples, and Pharaoh notices. He offers a compromise. Sacrifice to your God, he says, but do it here, inside Egypt. Moses refuses. This isn't a negotiation. It's a rescue. The fifth plague strikes Egypt's livestock, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, all dying in the fields. And it lands directly on 2 more Egyptian gods at once. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of protection, and Apis, the sacred bull worshipped as a living god in his own temple with his own priesthood, both depended on cattle remaining alive, healthy, and untouchable. A single sacred Apis bull, when it died of natural causes, was mourned with a state funeral rivaling Pharaoh's own. Now, ordinary cattle die across the entire nation in a single day, Egypt's most sacred animals reduced to carcasses in open fields. Again, the Israelites' livestock is untouched. Not a single one dies. Pharaoh sends men to check, the text notes. He wants to know if this claim is even true, and it is. The sixth plague turns personal in a different way. Moses throws soot into the air, and boils break out on every Egyptian and every Egyptian animal. Even, the text specifically notes, on Pharaoh's own magicians, who can no longer even stand before Moses because of the sores covering their own skin. The very men who had been performing counterfeit miracles to match God's plagues, standing shoulder to shoulder with Pharaoh through 5 previous confrontations, are now too physically broken to even show their faces at the 6th. The 7th plague is where the story stops being merely uncomfortable and starts becoming apocalyptic. Moses warns Pharaoh in advance this time. The worst hailstorm in Egypt's history is coming, mixed with fire running along the ground, and Pharaoh is given a chance to bring his people and livestock indoors before it hits. Some Egyptians listen, many don't, and the text notes their loss specifically, as if to make clear that mercy was genuinely offered and genuinely ignored. The hail destroys flax and barley across the land, shattering trees that had stood for years in a matter of minutes, and this plague strikes directly at Nut, the sky goddess whose body was believed to arch over the entire earth as the heavens themselves, and Set, the god of storms and chaos. The very deities supposedly responsible for controlling weather itself, now proven powerless to stop a storm aimed specifically at their own worshippers. Pharaoh, for one brief moment, actually breaks. "I have sinned," he tells Moses. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray for me." It is the closest this entire story comes to something that sounds like genuine repentance, spoken, notably, only once the hail is already destroying everything around him, rather than before it ever started. And the moment the hail stops, the text tells you exactly what happens to that confession. He sinned yet again and hardened his heart, his and his officials both, as if the fear that produced those words evaporated the instant its cause did. The 8th plague brings locusts, swarming so thick they cover the surface of the whole land until it's black, devouring every plant the hail had left standing, every leaf, every bit of fruit, stripping trees bare down to their branches within a single day. This plague answers directly to Seth, the god supposedly responsible for protecting crops from exactly this kind of destruction, and to Renanute, the cobra-headed goddess of harvest and grain storage whose entire role was guaranteeing exactly the kind of abundance now being devoured in front of Pharaoh's own officials, who, notably, are the ones who finally beg Pharaoh to let Israel go before Egypt itself is completely destroyed. By the time the locusts finish, there is not a green thing left in all the land of Egypt. The 9th plague may be the most theological a direct blow of all 10. Darkness falls over Egypt, not ordinary darkness, but a darkness that can be felt, the text says, thick enough that no one can see anyone else or leave their place for 3 full days. And Egypt's national religion was fundamentally solar. Ra, the sun god, sat at the very top of their entire pantheon, believed to travel across the sky each day in a solar barge and through the underworld each night, battling chaos itself to guarantee the sun's return every single morning. Pharaoh himself claimed to be Ra's living son on earth. For 3 days, Ra simply does not show up, and there is nothing Egypt's entire religious system, and nothing its living god king, can do about it, while, once again, the text specifically notes that all the people of Israel had light where they lived. 3 days is long enough to run out of stored food not already spoiled, long enough for fear to curdle into panic, long enough for a nation that measured time itself by the sun's movement to begin to wonder if time had simply stopped. If you're starting to notice that not one of these 10 disasters was random, you're exactly right, and if patterns like this are what you come to this channel for, there's a new one waiting every week. And then comes the 10th. Pharaoh, blind with fury by this point, tells Moses, "Get out of my sight, and never come near me again, or you will die." Moses' answer is almost eerily calm, "I will not see your face again." The 10th plague is announced in advance, in exact detail, and it targets the one claim Egyptian religion has protected above every other: the divine status of Pharaoh's own household, and the future of every household in the land. At midnight, the text says, every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from Pharaoh's own son on the throne, down to the firstborn of the slave girl behind the mill, and even the firstborn of the livestock. This is not simply another disaster. This is a direct strike at the succession of Pharaoh's own divine bloodline, the very thing his entire religious identity rests on. But this time, God gives Israel something to do, not just somewhere safe to stand. Each household is instructed to take a lamb without blemish, a year-old male, and keep it in their home for 4 full days before the night it happens, long enough, some have suggested, for a family to grow attached to the animal they were about to sacrifice, so that the cost of the doorway's protection would never feel abstract. At twilight, they kill it, and paint its blood on the 2 doorposts and the lintel above the door, using a branch of hyssop as a brush. When I see the blood, God says, I will pass over you. This is the origin of the word Passover, and the instructions that follow are almost unbearably specific. Roast the meat whole, eat it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, dressed and ready to leave immediately, staff in hand, sandals already on your feet, because tonight, everything changes, and there will be no time to pack once it starts. At midnight, the plague moves through Egypt exactly as promised. There is not a house, the text says, where someone is not dead. Pharaoh, the man who called himself a living god, wakes his own household to the sound of his own son's death, in the same hour that every other father in Egypt discovers the same thing. And this time, there is no hardening left in him. He summons Moses in the middle of the night and tells him, simply, go. 10 plagues. 10 specific, deliberate strikes, each one landing on a god the Egyptians believed controlled exactly the thing that plague destroyed. The Nile's god couldn't save the Nile. The fertility goddess became a plague of frogs. The sky god couldn't stop the hail. The sun god didn't rise for 3 straight days. And the living God on Egypt's throne could not protect his own son, in his own house, on the one night that mattered most. Here's what this pattern actually tells you, once you see all 10 laid out together. This was never simply about winning Israel's freedom through brute force. Every plague was a direct, specific answer to a specific claim, a systematic dismantling of an entire civilization's confidence that its gods, its king, and its religious order controlled anything at all. 10 plagues, 10 gods answered by name in effect, if not always in the text itself. The river god who couldn't save his own river. The frog-headed fertility goddess turned into a plague. The sky god who couldn't stop the hail. The harvest gods who couldn't save a single green leaf. The sun god who didn't rise for 3 straight days. And the living God on Egypt's throne who could not protect his own son, in his own house, on the one night that mattered most. God didn't just defeat Egypt. He answered, one by one, deliberately and in order, nearly everything Egypt had ever worshipped instead of him. And here is the detail worth carrying with you longest. Through all 10 plagues, escalating from inconvenient to catastrophic to unbearable, one thing never changes. The distinction God draws between Egypt and the people he is rescuing. Flies that skip Goshen, livestock that lives while Egypt dies. Light where Egypt sits in darkness thick enough to touch. Even in the middle of judgment poured out at a scale that reshapes an entire nation, there was always, deliberately, a door with blood on it, and a promise attached to walking through it. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. Pharaoh spent this entire story insisting he didn't know who the Lord was. By the end of it, there wasn't a household left in Egypt that didn't. 10 plagues, 10 gods answered, one door, in every single Israelite home, marked with blood that meant exactly what it promised. Egypt would spend generations trying to forget this night. Israel would spend the rest of its history refusing to.